Title is From Necessity to Sustainability, How the Threads of Clothing Wove Passion Through 4 Generations. As a child, much of my clothing was handmade by my mother and my grandmother. I grew up watching my mother sew play clothes and dance costumes. As the oldest of 3 girls, there were a lot of dance costumes. I have such special memories of handmade flannel pajamas magically appearing on my bed on Christmas Eve. When I was 12, I asked for a new robe for Christmas. What a surprise when I awoke to a sewing machine and some fabric. With this gift began my passion for sewing my own clothes. When I was in elementary school and middle school, I had a really good friend named Margaret, and she would bring down bags of hand-me-downs. I remember the excitement each time she brought me a new bag of her outgrown clothing. I remember one bag. It had olive green bell-bottoms and desert boots. It was the 70s. It felt like my birthday. It wasn't until I got into high school when I realized that homemade clothing and hand-me-downs were not really that cool. And to fit in, you needed to wear name brand clothing. So I began my journey to buy store-bought clothes. My only exception was making dresses for every school dance that I attended. When I was finished, my grandmother would take the scraps, never wanting to waste, and would make me these beautiful little bags to bring to the dance. Later, when I started out in my career, money was extremely tight. I worked in an office where we were expected to dress professionally. So out of necessity, I began shopping at thrift shops and resale shops to build my wardrobe. With the sewing skills that I learned from my mother and my grandmother, I was able to put together a very nice professional wardrobe. Even when my salary increased, I still enjoyed shopping for gently used clothing and reworking them to make them my own. When my daughters were born, I was surprised how quickly they outgrew their clothes. It just made more sense to me to shop at thrift shops and children's resales rather than to continually buy new clothes. And I also love to exchange clothing and patterns with other young moms. Later, after being laid off, out of necessity again, I built a business called Solutions. I helped modify individuals' clothing so that it would fit and function better for people with special needs. After years of repairing and reworking clothing, this type of work came easy for me. Long before people were talking about reducing, reusing, repurposing to lessen our carbon footprint, that's what I was doing without even knowing it. As my daughters grew older, they also began that phase of being unimpressed with thrift shop and handmade clothing. They wanted fast fashion instead. But over the years, what had started as a necessity to provide for myself and my family, it was imprinting something much larger and more important on my daughters. I have watched both of my daughters, sorry, I'm getting emotional. I've watched both of my daughters grow up to treasure the threads of clothing that have come before us and to truly care about the earth and the detriment that fast fashion has caused and continues to cause. I'm proud to witness how both of my girls have developed and expressed their passion for vintage clothing and styles in 2 completely different ways. About my daughters. Brittany, as a young woman, my daughter Brittany became very interested in learning to sew so she could make her own creative clothing. As her skills developed, she also grew more concerned for the environment and committed to live as green a life as possible. While completing her master's degree in peace and justice, Brittany studied the environmental and human impacts of the clothing production. With this degree, she has found a way to combine her passion for sewing her own garments and the skills gained to advocate for systematic reform of the clothing industry. To see her beautiful garments and her connections with other sewists, I do have QR code, so you can see her Instagram. My other daughter, Kinsey, who is filming, she has a great passion for vintage garments. This is quite the flair. One of her first jobs was working at a store where she bought and sold gently used clothing. While she worked at this job, she developed her love for vintage fashion throughout the years. She has developed knowledge of brands, styling, notions, fabrics that were popular in every decade. Her passion for vintage clothing has led her to create her own business, Realist Vintage. She's so familiar with each decade's styles that she can quickly search through clothing and pluck out a garment from, say, the 40s or the 70s, where someone else may just walk by that special piece. Kinsey would say she's a purist. It's important for her to keep every garment she finds in its original form, only making the necessary repairs to bring it back to its original beauty. And she lets me help her do that. To see some of Kinsey's wonderful vintage finds, visit her shop. It is warm to me to watch the threads of clothing pass through 4 generations of my family through necessity, passion, creativity to sustain them.